Welcome back! My name is ballerscuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1982, and we are still in Wizardry II. When we last left off, we beat the game. So today, while watching scenes of me playing and probably not beating the game, let's talk about the game as a whole. Let's talk about how it felt to play the game from a modern standpoint. We're going to talk about kind of the whole concept of the game, and we will try to include as much as we can on my thoughts on the game, and then we will wrap things up afterwards. So the game as a whole, I would say I had more fun playing this game than I did the first game. But at the same time, a lot of that had to do with my setup going in, my preparation going into the game. Because of what happened in Wizardry I, I was prepared for bad things to happen in Wizardry II. So I was fully prepared to have backup saves. I had already cheated to get the party that I needed. All that stuff had happened before I started playing the game. So it was easier, and it showed in the gameplay that it was easier, but that was not necessarily because of what was programmed in the game itself. Some of that was because of what I had done to make it easier for myself. Let's talk about kind of the setup for this game. It is an odd choice, to say the least, that in order to play Wizardry II, you have to have played Wizardry I. There is no way to create new characters in Wizardry II. The only way to play it is to import the characters in from the first game. As a result, it doesn't really feel like its own game. It feels like a sequel, but more like a continuation of the first game. It's more like an add-on to the first game. From a modern standpoint, we would call it either an expansion or DLC, but back then those terms didn't really exist. So we're just kind of talking about something tacked on to the first game. That's what it felt like when you play this game. It doesn't feel like its own standalone game, and it isn't its own standalone game. And you know that back in 1982, when this game was released, not every salesperson that sold this game was going to be aware that you needed the first game in order to play the second game. I did show it on. I did show the box. The box art doesn't really give anything away for that. It's something that caused problems back in the day. There are some times now when you can buy an expansion set, you don't read the fine print on the box, and then you walk out of the store. Not that that happens too often these days. Most of the purchasing is online. But if you are to go get a box in the store and it says, expansion set, not everybody's going to read that. Sometimes it's given as a gift, and the people that give it don't know that. I can only imagine what would have happened back then. So some people bought this second game and then could not play it, and possibly never played the game because you needed the first game in order to play this second game. So I would argue that is a bad choice on the designer's part, simply because it's going to cause problems, and it also limits the amount of people that can play the game. Your target audience is now suddenly limited to your existing customers. You can't get new customers. And in 1982, for video games in particular, that seems like a bad choice to me. It seems like you're not growing the franchise, you're not growing your sales base. It just seems like you are trying to make more money on your existing fans, and as a result, this game cannot be as popular as the first game. By default, it cannot be that, because more people had to buy Wizardry I than Wizardry II. It just had to happen that way. With that said, I did appreciate that there was a story to this game. There was something going on. The fact that there was kind of an all-powerful being that we were trying to impress, was something that I did like. With that said, there were some things that I thought were odd. I wouldn't necessarily call them plot holes, but they're definitely in that vein. For me, I wanted there to be some sort of evil villain in the dungeon. Some sort of bad guy that was causing bad things to happen. The bad guy should have done something to stop the Knight of Diamonds, or done something to stop the prince that we assume went down there earlier. Something that prevented the city from being saved, so to speak, by Nilda. But as it turned out in the game, there really wasn't a bad guy. It was just find the stuff, find the equipment for the Knight of Diamonds, show it to Nilda, and then Nilda will bestow you the staff, and then you'll save the city. That's how the game ended up playing out. There wasn't really a bad guy. There wasn't a big bad final boss. There wasn't anybody doing that. So from a plot perspective, that means that Nilda always had the ability to save the town and chose not to until somebody proved that they were good enough to save the town themselves, that you were strong enough to get the stuff. I'm not entirely sure what the point of this test was from Nilda's perspective, but the fact that there wasn't anything stopping Nilda this whole time didn't ring as well for me. That isn't necessarily a plot hole, but it is weird. It's also weird that I have to assume, based on the structure of these two games, that our characters are not originally from Lilgamen, right? We started in Wizardry 1 in Trebor's Castle. We have to assume, at least I have to assume, that's a different town. That is not where Lilgamen is. It's not the same castle. So for Nilda to save Lilgamen because some outsiders came and found some stuff and gave it to Nilda, it seems a little odd. It doesn't seem like the town itself proved anything. You know, my characters did, and my characters are not from Lilgamen, based on what I can tell. So what little plot there was good, but it had holes in it. So I have mixed feelings about the plot. Is it better to have no plot and have a better sense of completion, or is it better to have plot and kind of feel like I didn't do all that much? It's a tough one that I'm kind of going back and forth on. In terms of graphics, right, the graphics have not changed. It's the same game. The gameplay hasn't really changed. It's the same game. The sound, of course, is non-existent. But in terms of the gameplay, let's talk about that a little bit more. In terms of like the level design, I would say that Wizardry II is far better than Wizardry 1. Wizardry 1, it felt like the levels were designed to stop you at all points, to confuse you, to make it feel like you didn't know where you were going, to make you feel hopelessly lost. There were even parts of the first game where if you went down the stairs, you essentially screwed yourself over and you could lose your entire party. That really wasn't something that happened in this second game. The second game, I feel, had much better level design because it was much fairer. It wasn't this hidden thing that could kill you at any point. There were pits, absolutely, but there weren't a ton of them all over the place and in key spots like they were in the first game. There were rotating tiles in this second game, but only on the bottom floor, which is entirely optional. They weren't bunched in a... They were, if I looked properly, sorry, kind of rambling about these pits. The rotating tiles. But the rotating tiles in the second game, they were all in positions where you could tell where you were. As long as you knew it was a rotating tile when you got there, you would be able to figure out where you were, which way you were facing, because they were all in strategic positions. That was not the case in the first game, where everything looked the same in all directions from that one tile, and you would have to cast a Duma pick in order to figure out which way you were facing. So I feel like the level design was much improved in this game. In terms of the enemies, I feel that the enemies were fairer in this game. Once again, only level 6 proved to be any sort of problem for me. I don't know if that's going to be the case for every gameplay through this, every run through of this game. But for me, only level 6 had any sort of difficulty to it that I felt was unfair. There was difficulty in some of the levels, particularly level 2, because you couldn't warp around. It was so big, it took so long for me to go through. It kind of proved difficult as an endurance run, which is something that I do enjoy in RPGs a lot. I do like the difficulty in endurance, not difficulty in a single fight or a single turn or something like that. So I felt that the enemies were fairer. I also feel that the randomness had cut down somewhat. And it didn't really have a lot to do with the numbers. Tilt-A-Wait and Malikdo, I believe, are the two highest spells. And those damage calculators didn't change. It was still 10 to 100 and I think 12 to 72. I think those are the numbers. Those didn't change. But it felt fair because the enemies themselves weren't going to do terrible things to you as often. And most of the enemies, I feel, were either on level 5 or level 6, where they could do devastating things to you. I think level 5 was the first time that we encountered enemies that could decapitate your characters. I feel that level 6 was the first time that we encountered enemies that could drain your levels. In the first game, those were much sooner presented. You had 10 levels, and I think once you got to level 8, bad things could start happening to you at any time. So you had to go through 3 levels in order to beat the game, and you had to go through the entire 10th level, and at any point you could get into a fight and lose because of how the game was designed. In this second game, it was really only that last level, and that last level was optional. So I feel like the enemy setup was fairer in this game than it was in the first game. But with that said, I do have to point out how disappointing the Knight of Diamonds equipment felt. All those fights were just odd and weird and not satisfying for me. I would argue that for me, the hardest fight was the Knight of Diamonds armor, which was the first fight. And once we got through that one fight and did all the damage we needed to do to beat that, it's not like it was hard, it just took a while. Everything after that was pretty easy. All the other equipment was not that difficult. As a result, it never really felt like I had a boss fight in this entire game. It didn't feel like I ever had a difficult fight that was scripted. All my difficult fights were against random enemies. And if we're being honest, the most difficult part of the game, the thing that presented the most difficulty for me, were treasure chests. But since most of the stuff that I wanted came from the fights with the Knight of Diamonds equipment, that's the best equipment in the game, I didn't really need to open up a single treasure chest this entire time. I could have made it all the way through with just what was available in the shop. So it was just kind of odd choices once again in this game. I do feel the need to talk about how equipment doesn't transfer between game 1 and game 2. I feel that's a bad choice. I don't see why that would need to happen. Why can't my characters come forward with their equipment? It might be plot-wise that's why you can't get into Lilgamen. You can't get into Lilgamen without getting rid of all your equipment, because then you present a challenge. You present some sort of, malevolent force against the city of Lilgamen. But that was only true when the staff was active, when the staff of Nilda was active, and it was not. So why did my characters lose all their equipment? I'm not entirely sure why that had to happen, other than to kind of reset you and make it feel more like a new game. But then, since all my gold transferred, I could just buy some of the equipment that I was missing, and I didn't really need to upgrade the characters too much after that. The advice that I was given about no level grinding in the second game, although that made my playthrough of this game more fun for me, I don't really see the point of that. I would argue that leveling your characters in Wizardry 2 is easier than Wizardry 1 towards the end, because in Wizardry 2, you can get more experience off of monsters on level 1, level 2, level 3, than you can from like level 7 in Wizardry 1, and you have no risk of losing levels in Wizardry 2, because those monsters aren't present in the early stages. So I would say that level grinding would be better in Wizardry 2. With that said, though, if you lose a character permanently, you have to start from Wizardry 1 all over again. You have to create a new character, get them up to level 13, transfer them over to Wizardry 2, and level grind them again. If that happens, that's awful, and you can waste dozens of hours doing that just once because something went bad and you didn't have a backup save, which, once again, is considered cheating in this game. I literally have to overwrite the game's data every time I reload a save. Because I knew how to do that, it made things easier for me this time. But if you didn't know how to do that, didn't feel it was right to do that, you could easily waste dozens of hours in this game. Just bringing one new character up to speed with everybody else. And I still think that is a bad decision. So that's kind of all my thoughts on the individual pieces of this game. Looking at it overall, I would say that I liked this game better than the first game. Because there wasn't a spot where I needed to stop and level grind for 10 hours or 20 hours. Once again, that had a lot to do with how I set up the characters, but I would make the argument that once you're about level 15, 16, you can probably beat this game. If you know what you're doing, you can probably do it in a couple hours if you know where to go. I should also point out, speaking of small things, the decision to make level 2 and level 6 the floors in which you cannot warp to was a very strange choice, and I wish that it was made apparent somewhere. I shouldn't have to Google, and I think I ended up having to Google like 5 different terms until I found somebody that talked about it. And I found one person that said, oh, by the way, you can't warp to level 2. I did hear a couple people say you can't warp to level 6, but the fact that I couldn't find anything until I was on level 4, basically saying you can't warp to level 2, and that's what was causing the problems. Just kind of shows that the game didn't really want to tell me all the information that it needed to. With the Catino and Montino being stronger in theory, that was made apparent at one point, but the fact that Maylord didn't work on to level 2 was something that should have been told to me at some point by the game or the manual, something. I don't know how, but give me something to let me know what's going on. But yeah, playing the game as a whole, I would say that I enjoyed this game more than the first game, but your experience may vary wildly. You can have no difficulty in Wizardry 1 and then suddenly have a lot of difficulty in Wizardry 2. It all depends on so many random factors in the game that are outside your control. It's not just your party setup, your levels, your equipment. It's also the fights that you get into and what magic is cast on you and what the random chances are that your levels are drained and what the random chance is that they decapitate one of your party members and then they don't get brought back at the temple. There's so much randomness to this game still that even though I had a better time in this, I can't guarantee that you're going to have a better time in this game than the first game. So it really does put it at a weird spot for me. Can I recommend this game? I would recommend it for the die-hard RPG fans, especially if you're a fan of the older style, the more slow, contemplative style. But I would highly recommend cheating still. I would recommend backup saves. I would recommend learning how to use the hex editor and editing the actual save itself. That was the only way I could even bring the characters in the first place. So I would recommend learning how to do that, not only to bring your characters in and make sure that the game still functions properly, but I would also recommend it in order to make sure that your characters don't get screwed over by some random chance that happens along the way. It didn't happen for me this time too often, but it could happen to you at any point. So it's difficult for me to recommend this to anybody new to RPGs. This is not the place to start if you are new to RPGs, but if you're a diehard fan and you want to see some of the beginnings of the game, this is a good place to start. With that said, it feels very much like a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So you play in a group, the group beats the first campaign, and then we're off on a second entirely new story that has nothing to do with the first game, the first campaign. That's what this felt like, but at the same point you bring your characters forward. It just feels like a new D&D session, which is good if that's what you're looking for. But for me personally, I would like some sort of continuation between the two games. So I guess that's my modern take on the game for hardcore fans only. And if you are interested in the old school stuff. But even if you are, I still would recommend cheating. Some people do want to put challenges on this game. I'm not sure why, but there is a single person challenge, a single party member challenge to try to beat this game. I would only recommend that if you don't explore and you know exactly where you're going. It's entirely possible. You have one character that has access to all the spells, like a samurai that has 9 uses of the level 7 spells. Then you can totally beat the game with one character. Not an issue. You just have to cast Tilt-A-Wait and hope you don't get into too many fights and then warp out when you're ready to go. But that's not something that I would recommend for really anybody for any reason, to be honest. There's other games for you to play. There's better games for you to play out there. And that's my modern take on the game. When the game was released, the critics did look relatively positively on the game. Critics enjoyed the variety of the monsters as well as the high difficulty of the challenge. However, other critics were disappointed with the game, saying it was not as good as the first game, and that it was truly only for the most hardcore fans. Because the game was truly only available to owners of the first game, the game did not sell as well as the first game. Because of this, the game never attained the popularity that the first game was able to achieve. Nevertheless, this would not be the last Wizardry game, and we will be revisiting the franchise as we continue. Looking ahead, because we will be hearing from Wizardry again, we will be hearing from Surtech Software again. We will also be hearing from the game's creators, Andrew C. Greenberg and Robert J. Woodhead again. That will do it for the story of Wizardry II for now. My name is ballerscuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we're surrounded.